The moment my husband placed his hand on Amber Cole's back and called her the future of this family, he had no idea he was cutting his own future to pieces. He said it so casually, too, as if he were announcing a change in dinner plans instead of erasing a woman who had spent 41 years building his life beside him. I remember the crystal chandelier above the dining room table, the soft yellow light catching the silver in my hair, the smell of rosemary chicken cooling on the platter between us. Everything looked warm. Everything looked respectable. That was the strange thing about betrayal. It rarely arrived wearing a villain's face. Most of the time, it came dressed for supper. I did not raise my voice. I did not knock over my chair or ask the questions clawing at my throat. I simply folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and looked at Richard Harper as if I were seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Amber sat to his right in a cream silk blouse I had once admired in a department store window, her posture too comfortable, her smile too careful. She was not family, not really. Not in the way I understood family. Yet there she was, seated in my place before anyone had the courage to admit they were moving me out of it. Nathan, my son, stared down into his water glass as if the ice cubes might rescue him from the shame of witnessing his father's performance. No one said my name. That hurt more than I can explain. Because being replaced does not begin when someone else takes your chair. It begins much earlier, in the small omissions. In the meetings you are no longer invited to. In the private jokes you are not meant to hear. In the way your photograph disappears from the hallway and no one mentions the empty nail left behind. 2 days earlier, I had stood in my own kitchen and felt something cold moving through the house like a draft under a locked door. Richard had been quieter than usual, distracted, answering questions with half sentences while his phone lit up face down beside his coffee cup. Amber's name had appeared on the guest list for that dinner without my knowledge. The account statements I usually kept in the top drawer of the study desk had been moved. Not lost. Moved. Deliberately. At my age, people assume you confuse details. That is one of the great advantages of growing older in a family that underestimates you. They stop hiding things well. So when Richard smiled across the table that night and said, "It's time we made room for what comes next," I understood that he believed I would break quietly and disappear with dignity. Perhaps that had always been his plan. Perhaps Amber had encouraged it. Perhaps both of them had mistaken kindness for weakness for far too long. I let the silence stretch. I let him think he was in control of it. Then I lifted my glass, took a slow sip of water, and smiled back at him. Because the truth was, he had not replaced me. Not yet. He had only revealed himself too soon. And once a man shows you exactly how little he values what you built for him, you stop mourning the marriage and start protecting the wreckage he is about to call his future. After dinner, I did what I had always done when life became too large to hold all at once. I cleaned the kitchen. I wrapped the untouched chicken in foil, transferred the green beans into a glass container, and wiped the counters until the granite shone under the pendant lights. The ordinary motions steadied me. They always had. For 41 years, this house had answered to my hands. I knew which cabinet door stuck in humid weather, which floorboard near the pantry gave a soft complaint under pressure, which lamp in the front room needed the bulb twisted twice before it came on. That was why the silence felt so unnatural. It was my house, and yet something in it had shifted beyond furniture and light. It felt as though the walls had already been told I was leaving, and no one had bothered to tell me. Richard went upstairs without offering to help, carrying his phone in one hand and the self-importance of a man who believed he had finally done something brave. Nathan mumbled good night and left through the side door, shoulders bent, as if shame had physical weight. Amber lingered by the dining room archway for a few seconds, watching me with the kind of careful expression people wear when they expect tears and are disappointed not to receive them. Then she followed Richard upstairs, her heels tapping softly against the wood treads that I had paid to have refinished 10 years ago. I stood at the sink and listened until the house settled again. Then I dried my hands, turned off the kitchen light, and walked into the front hall. The framed family photographs ran along the staircase wall in neat black frames I had chosen myself. Nathan at age 8 in a Little League uniform, missing his front tooth and smiling into the sun. Our Christmas portrait from 2009, all red velvet ribbons and forced patience. A summer picture at Cape Cod where Richard still looked at me as though I were part of the life he wanted rather than an obstacle to some newer version of it. Halfway up the stairs, I stopped. My portrait from our 40th anniversary party was gone. I knew exactly where it had hung because the paint around the missing frame was slightly darker than the rest of the wall. I touched the empty space with 2 fingers. No dust. It had not been removed months ago. It had been taken down recently. Deliberately. That was the first moment I allowed myself to admit this had not begun at the dinner table. The dinner had only been the unveiling. The real work of replacing me had been happening in pieces, quietly, while I was still setting out folded napkins and remembering everybody's preferences for coffee. I went to Richard's study next. The door was partly open, though he had started closing it more often in the past few weeks. His desk looked too neat. Richard was never neat unless he wanted something hidden. The brass letter opener sat parallel to the edge. The leather blotter had no loose papers on it. The top drawer, where I kept copies of insurance documents and property tax receipts, opened with less resistance than usual. Inside, the folders were there, but not in my order. I had always organized them by year, marked in blue tabs. Now several of the tabs had been replaced with white ones in Amber's sharp little handwriting. I recognized it from the place cards she had once offered to make for Easter brunch, each letter too elegant to be sincere. I stood there for a long time, looking at those white tabs. That was when I understood the true insult of what Richard had done. He had not simply betrayed me. He had invited another woman to rehearse my absence inside my own life. He thought I would discover it too late, after the signatures, after the explanations, after the decent people at the country club had been told a version of the story that made him sound modern and me sound tired. But I was not tired. I was awake in a way I had not been for years. And as I quietly put every folder back exactly as I found it, I realized something that made me smile in the dark. People who are busy replacing you usually become careless about what they leave behind. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because betrayal has a way of sharpening the senses while it dulls everything else. The house was still dark, wrapped in that gray hour when even expensive rooms look honest. I slipped out of bed, put on my robe, and walked downstairs without turning on any lights. For years, I had loved those early hours. The silence had once felt peaceful, like the pause before a hymn begins in church. That morning, it felt more like a courtroom waiting for someone to speak. I started the coffee maker and stood at the kitchen window watching the backyard emerge inch by inch from the dark. The hydrangeas along the fence were beginning to bloom. I had planted them myself after Nathan left for college, back when I still believed empty spaces could always be filled with something beautiful if you were patient enough. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Amber entering the kitchen in one of Richard's old Harvard t-shirts, the hem tied neatly at her waist as though she had every right in the world to make herself comfortable there. She stopped when she saw me, but only for half a second. Then that practiced smile returned to her face. "You are up early," she said, walking toward the refrigerator as if she had known where everything belonged for years. I did not answer right away. I watched her open the wrong cabinet for mugs, hesitate, then recover by reaching to the shelf above the coffee station where I kept the good white cups for family breakfasts. Richard had shown her. Not once, not casually. Enough. Times for her to feel almost at home. "So are you," I said. My voice came out calm. Too calm for the scene she had probably prepared herself for. She poured herself coffee, added the vanilla creamer Richard used to tease me for buying, and leaned one hip against the counter. "Richard is meeting with the attorney at noon," she said, eyes on her cup. He thought it might be easier if everything stayed civil. Civil. There are words that reveal more than they hide. Civil meant decided. Civil meant they had already arranged the future and simply expected me to sign my name somewhere at the bottom like a polite witness to my own removal. I nodded once and turned back toward the window. Did he now? Amber let the silence sit between us, perhaps hoping I would fill it with panic, accusation, anything she could later describe as instability. Instead, I asked whether she wanted toast. I wish I could say she looked ashamed. She did not. What she looked was relieved. Relieved that I seemed small enough to manage. A few minutes later, Richard came in dressed for the office in a navy suit and one of the silk ties I had given him for our 35th anniversary. He kissed Amber on the cheek without seeing me watch it in the reflection of the window glass. Then he spotted me, gave a slight start, and straightened his cufflinks. "Evelyn," he said, as though my being in my own kitchen required explanation. "We should all try to keep things reasonable today." I turned from the sink and looked at him carefully, taking in the polished shoes, the rehearsed expression, the confidence of a man who believed paperwork could bless any betrayal if the margins were neat enough. Of course, I said. Reasonable has always been your favorite word when you want something to sound smaller than it is. Neither of them answered that. Richard reached for the travel mug I had used to fill every weekday for nearly 2 decades, and Amber handed it to him before I could move. Such a small gesture. Such a vicious one. That was when I understood the deepest wound of all. They were not merely stepping into my life. They were practicing the rhythm of it together, stealing the ordinary rituals that had once made a marriage feel real. And as Richard walked out the back door with my morning routine in his hand, I made a quiet promise to myself. Let them keep rehearsing. By noon, I intended to learn exactly which part of my life they believed they had already stolen. After Richard left for the office, I went upstairs and opened the cedar chest at the foot of our bed, the one I had not touched in months because some memories are easier to love from a distance. Inside were 41 years of a life I had once believed was solid. There were yellowing mortgage papers with both our signatures from 1983, a stack of Christmas cards tied with cream ribbon, and the faded notebook where I had tracked every major household expense when money was tight and ambition was bigger than our bank account. Richard liked to tell people he built everything from grit and instinct. That was his favorite version of himself. Clean, self-made, applaudable over cocktails. But the truth lived in cardboard folders and old receipts. The truth was that when he wanted to start his consulting business, I refinanced the house in my name because his credit had taken a hit after a failed investment he still blamed on the economy. When Nathan was 6 and the babysitter quit without notice, I left a full-time job at the hospital so Richard could travel without worrying about school pickups or fevers in the middle of the night. When his father grew ill, I was the one who drove him to appointments, managed prescriptions, and still made sure Richard never missed a client dinner because his white shirt had not been pressed. It is a strange thing, looking back on a marriage after the illusion breaks. You do not remember the grand moments first. You remember the practical mercies, the packed lunches, the canceled plans, the years of saying yes to someone else's future because you believed the life you were building belonged to both of you. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened our anniversary album from our 20th year. In one photograph, Richard was laughing with his arm around my waist, both of us standing in the backyard under strings of white lights I had insisted on hanging myself because he said the electrician charged too much. I looked happy, not foolish, not blind, just happy. That is what makes betrayal so offensive in the end. It turns your own good faith into evidence against you, as though loving fully were the same thing as failing to notice. Around 11 o'clock, I carried the album downstairs and returned the chest to its place. On my way through the hallway, I paused by the console table where I used to keep fresh flowers every Friday. The vase was empty. Amber had moved in with the sort of confidence that skips over grace and goes straight to possession. Yet even in her little adjustments, I could see how little she understood. She had taken my portrait from the wall, but left the silver frame from Nathan's graduation slightly crooked. She had relabeled folders in the study, but missed the old fireproof box in the linen closet where I kept copies of everything that mattered. She had stepped into routines she thought were decorative, never realizing they had once been the scaffolding of a life she could not possibly recreate. By the time I heard my phone ring just before noon, I was no longer trembling. I was sitting in the breakfast room with a cup of tea gone cold beside me and 41 years of memory arranged quietly in my mind, like testimony waiting to be called. When I saw the name on the screen, Grace Whitmore, I felt something settle inside me. Grace had been our family attorney for years before retiring from daily practice, and she was not the sort of woman who called at lunch for social reasons. I answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, low, deliberate. "Evelyn," she said, "I believe there are some things you need to know before you walk into that meeting today." Grace did not waste words. That was one of the reasons I had always trusted her. She had spent 30 years around wealthy men in expensive suits, and she knew the difference between confidence and theater. "Richard requested copies of several legacy documents 3 weeks ago," she said. I could hear papers shifting softly on her end of the line. Not through me directly, through one of the younger attorneys at Barrett and Cole. He asked for ownership summaries, trust language, transfer authority, and the original operating agreement from the consulting firm. I looked out toward the backyard, where the hydrangeas stood in their neat blue clusters, innocent as Sunday china. And I asked. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Grace paused for just a breath, and he did not request the amendments. That caught my attention more than anything else she could have said. Richard had always skimmed what favored him and ignored what protected me. It was one of his oldest habits, almost charming when the stakes were low. It was not charming now. Which amendments? I asked. The revisions your father insisted on after the refinance in 1996, she said. The ones that were later reinforced after you and Richard restructured the firm in 2008. Evelyn, the primary residence cannot be sold or transferred without your written consent. More importantly, a controlling share of the consulting firm was placed in the family trust years ago, with you as co-trustee and sole acting authority in the event of marital misconduct involving concealed financial interference. For a second, I said nothing. Not because I did not understand, but because I understood perfectly. My father had never trusted charm. He used to say that a man who loved applause more than accountability would eventually confuse the two. I remembered the fight Richard and I had after those papers were signed. He had called the provisions unnecessary. My father had called them prudent. I had let the matter rest because I believed caution would never be needed in a decent marriage. Grace continued in that same calm tone. I should also tell you that Amber's name appears nowhere that matters, no matter what picture they may be trying to paint. A few relabeled folders do not create ownership. Neither do assumptions made over dinner. I sat down slowly at the breakfast table. The tea beside me had gone cold, but I wrapped my hands around the cup anyway. So what exactly are they planning at noon? I asked. Grace exhaled. My guess is pressure. They will present partial documents, simplified numbers, perhaps a proposal framed as dignified and efficient. They are hoping you will be too shocked, too hurt, or too tired to insist on full review. I almost laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because the arrogance of it all suddenly felt so familiar. Richard had not built a strategy. He had built a performance, and like most performances, it depended entirely on the audience agreeing to believe it. What should I do? I asked. Grace's answer came immediately. Let them speak. Do not correct them too soon. Do not show them what you know. And whatever they place in front of you, do not sign a single page before I arrive. I closed my eyes for a moment and pictured Richard straightening his tie, Amber hovering nearby with those elegant little notes in her sharp handwriting, both of them so certain the day would end with my surrender. Grace lowered her voice. Evelyn, they think they are replacing you. What they are actually doing is exposing themselves in writing. That matters. I opened my eyes and looked toward the hallway where my missing portrait had hung. The empty space no longer felt like an insult. It felt like evidence. Thank you, I said. I believe I needed to hear it from someone who still respects paper more than promises. Grace gave a soft sound that might have been agreement. One more thing, she said. Nathan called my office this morning. He did not leave details, only asked whether his father had the right to force changes to the trust. He sounded unsettled. That stopped me cold in a different way. Nathan had looked ashamed at dinner, but shame and courage are not the same thing. Still, the fact that he had called meant something inside him had not gone completely still. I see, I said. Then perhaps by noon, more than one person in that room will be hearing the truth for the first time. When the call ended, I placed the phone carefully on the table and sat for another minute in the quiet. Then I rose, went upstairs, and chose my clothes with unusual care. Not because I wanted to look impressive. At 67, I had long since stopped dressing for approval. I chose a navy dress, pearl earrings, and the silver watch my mother left me because I wanted to feel like myself when the lies began. And as I fastened the clasp at my wrist, I realized Richard had made the same mistake so many careless people make when they decide a woman has become easy to remove. He had confused patience with surrender. By the time I stepped out of the bedroom, I was no longer walking into a meeting to defend my place. I was walking into a room where two very foolish people were about to discover they had challenged the wrong woman. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of Barrett & Cole, the sky had turned the pale white blue of early afternoon, bright without warmth. The building itself was exactly what men like Richard preferred in professional settings: all glass, brushed steel, and silence polished to look expensive. I sat in my car for a moment with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel and watched people move in and out through the revolving door. 10 years ago, I might have walked in already wounded, already defending myself against whatever version of the truth someone else had prepared for me. That day, I walked in curious. There is a power in knowing more than the people trying to corner you. It settles the breath. It slows the pulse. It lets you become still enough to watch them make mistakes. Amber was already in the lobby when I entered, standing near the reception desk in a cream skirt and a fitted jacket, holding a leather folder against her chest as though she were the one with legitimate business there. She turned when she heard my heels on the marble floor and gave me a smile that managed to be both pleasant and territorial. "Evelyn," she said, lowering her voice as if we were sharing a confidence. "Richard is upstairs. He wanted this to be as smooth as possible." I returned her smile, or something close enough to one. "How thoughtful," I said. The receptionist looked up, recognized my name, and immediately stood. That tiny shift did not escape Amber. Respect has its own body language, and women like her always notice when it is not directed at them. "Mrs. Harper," the receptionist said warmly, "Mr. Bennett is expecting you in conference room B. Ms. Whitmore has also called and asked that nothing begin until she arrives." For the first time all day, Amber's expression flickered. Just once. A quick narrowing of the eyes. A recalculation. Then it was gone. "Of course," she said, though no one had asked her anything. We rode the elevator in silence. I could smell her perfume, something soft and expensive, the sort of fragrance chosen to leave a memory behind. She kept glancing at my reflection in the mirrored wall, perhaps searching for cracks. I gave her none. On the 4th floor, she led me down a hushed hallway, lined with abstract paintings and dark wood doors. Conference room B was at the end, with a long walnut table, a wall of windows, and Richard standing near the far side in his navy suit with one hand tucked into his pocket. Nathan was already seated, his elbows on the table, fingers interlocked so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. He looked up when I entered, and the shame in his face had deepened into something sharper. Fear, perhaps. Not of me. Of what the day might expose. Richard stepped forward with the solemn expression people wear at funerals and negotiations, as if dignity were a costume you could put on after behaving badly. "Evelyn," he said, pulling out a chair for me. "Thank you for coming." I placed my purse on the table and sat down without touching the chair he offered. "You made it sound compulsory," I said. Nathan looked away. Amber took the seat beside Richard, opened her folder, and arranged 3 neat stacks of papers in front of him. Again, that tiny viciousness. She was not merely attending. She was assisting. She believed herself indispensable. Richard folded his hands and began in the tone I had once heard him use with nervous clients. Gentle, controlled, almost kind. "I think it is best if we approach this practically. There is no reason for anyone to make things more painful than they need to be." I did not answer. I simply looked at him. Silence, I had learned, forces dishonest people to decorate their own lies. He cleared his throat and continued. "The house is larger than you need, and maintaining it alone would be difficult. The firm also requires stability right now, and uncertainty at home can have consequences professionally. We have prepared an arrangement that provides you with comfort, privacy, and a fair monthly allowance." A fair monthly allowance. 41 years reduced to a stipend, as if I were a distant relative being managed into retirement rather than the woman who had helped build every visible inch of his success. Amber slid the first packet toward me with manicured fingers and a look that tried very hard to appear compassionate. "This simply outlines the transition," she said. Transition. There was that word again, so polished, so bloodless, so eager to make theft sound civilized. I rested my fingertips on the top page, but did not lift it. "And what exactly," I asked softly, "am I transitioning out of?" Richard leaned back, perhaps relieved that I had finally spoken. He mistook calm for surrender the way he always had. "The burdens of a life that no longer fits," he said. "The house. Administrative responsibilities. Public involvement with the firm. It is time to make room for what comes next." The room went very still after that. Even Nathan flinched. Richard had said it now in front of witnesses, in front of paper, in front of people who could never again claim this was all a misunderstanding born of emotion. He thought the sentence made him sound decisive. To me, it sounded like a confession. I lowered my eyes to the packet, turned one page, then another, letting them believe I was absorbing the terms for the first time. Partial summaries. Selective figures. No amendment language. No trust provisions. No mention of the signatures that actually mattered. Exactly as Grace had predicted. I looked up slowly, first at Richard, then at Amber, and finally at Nathan, whose face had gone so tense it seemed to ache. I see, I said, and because they still did not realize the trap they were building around themselves, I let my voice soften just enough to encourage them onward. Please, I said, go on. Richard took my invitation to continue as permission to become bolder. I watched the change happen in real time. The slight easing of his shoulders, the return of that familiar executive calm he wore whenever he believed a room belonged to him. He tapped the first page with 2 fingers and began explaining figures I already knew were incomplete. The residence, he said, would remain available to me for a limited transitional period if I chose to be cooperative. The firm, he added, needed centralized leadership without emotional complication. He said it all in the tone of a man discussing weather delays or quarterly planning, as though removing his wife from her own life were an administrative inconvenience requiring grace and efficiency. Amber nodded at the appropriate moments, sliding pages forward, angling charts toward me, performing the role of trusted advisor with an ease that would have been almost impressive if it had not been so grotesque. Nathan remained silent for most of it, but silence has texture, and his was beginning to fray. I could see it. In the way he kept glancing at the document packet and then away again, as if every page contained something he had not agreed to witness. At last he spoke. Dad, he said quietly, when exactly was all of this prepared? Richard did not look at him right away. Over the past few weeks, he said, it became clear that delay would only make things harder. Nathan frowned. For who? Amber answered before Richard could. For everyone involved, she said, her voice polished, patient, entirely too practiced. The goal is stability. Stability. Another elegant word offered in place of honesty. I turned a page and found a summary table with projected distributions, housing costs, and a line item labeled discretionary support, as if I were already a dependent managed through a budget category. I almost admired the nerve of it. Almost. Richard leaned forward then, his eyes settling on me with something that might once have resembled concern. Evelyn, I know this is not easy, he said, but you have to understand that life changes. People change. What worked 20 years ago does not necessarily work now. There it was. Not just the legal maneuvering, not just the quiet theft of routines and rooms, but the philosophy beneath it. The belief that longevity could be rewritten as irrelevance the moment something newer entered the frame. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at him without blinking. And Amber, I asked, keeping my voice level, what exactly is Amber's role in all of this? It was the first time I had addressed the truth directly in that room. Amber lifted her chin slightly, as though she had been waiting for acknowledgement. Richard answered for her. Amber has been assisting with firm outreach, event planning, and a number of transitional matters. She understands where things are headed. The sentence landed with a soft, ugly certainty. Not a misunderstanding. Not an unfortunate overlap. A succession. He had not merely made room for her. He had begun introducing her into the architecture of my absence. Nathan turned toward him sharply then, all restraint suddenly thinning. You brought her into business decisions before talking to Mom. Richard's jaw tightened. I did what was necessary. Necessary for who? Nathan said again, louder this time. Amber sat back, the folder still open in front of her, but the smoothness had left her face now. She had expected tears from me, perhaps awkward compliance from Nathan, but not resistance that might force the truth into daylight before its paperwork was complete. Richard gave his son the look he used when he wanted obedience without conversation. This is between your mother and me. Nathan laughed once, but there was no humor in it. No, it stopped being just between you two when you started rearranging everything behind her back. For the first time that afternoon, I saw something crack in Richard's control. Not much, just enough to reveal the impatience beneath it. I am trying to handle this with dignity, he said. Your mother deserves security, not chaos. Security. Another allowance word. Another careful insult wrapped in benevolence. I let the silence return, because by then the room no longer needed my pain. It needed only my patience. Richard looked back at me, perhaps hoping I would rescue him from his son's disgust by playing the composed woman who always restored order after his selfishness made a mess. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Do you truly believe," I said, "that you can replace a wife, reassign a life, and call the result dignity?" No one moved. Even the air seemed to hold itself still. Richard stared at me, and for the first time since dinner the night before, he looked uncertain not of what he wanted, but of whether he had understood me at all. Amber lowered her eyes to the table. Nathan sat back slowly, as though something inside him had finally taken shape. And then, just as Richard opened his mouth to answer, the conference room door swung inward and Grace Whitmore stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase and a look on her face that made the temperature in the room seem to drop by 10 degrees. Grace did not apologize for being late. Women like Grace never apologize when they arrive carrying facts. She stepped into the room in a charcoal suit, set her leather briefcase on the walnut table, and gave Richard the sort of cool nod one offers a man who has mistaken strategy for cleverness. "I hope nothing has been signed," she said. Mr. Bennett, the junior attorney who had been sitting quietly near the end of the table, straightened at once. "No, Ms. Whitmore," he said. "We were only reviewing a proposed transition." Grace's mouth barely moved, but I saw the disapproval settle into place. "Then perhaps we should review the complete record rather than the theatrical version." Richard stood a little straighter, which had always been his first response to being challenged by someone he could not easily charm. "Grace, this is a private family matter," he said. She opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder secured with blue tabs. It stopped being private the moment incomplete disclosures were presented in a law office, as though they represented full authority. Amber said nothing, but her hand tightened around the edge of her folder. Nathan turned toward Grace with the raw attention of someone who knew, finally, that the truth had arrived. Grace remained standing as she laid out the documents one by one with a precision that felt almost surgical. Original trust amendments, co-trustee authority, property restrictions, operating revisions from the consulting firm, addendum language referencing marital misconduct tied to concealed financial manipulation. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Paper has its own volume when it is placed in front of a liar. "For clarity," she said, looking first at Mr. Bennett and then at Richard, "the Harper residence cannot be sold, transferred, reassigned, or leveraged without Mrs. Harper's written consent. There is no exception in these documents that permits convenience, preference, embarrassment, or infatuation." The last word landed softly, but it landed. Richard's face changed in a way I had not seen in decades. Not anger first. Confusion. Genuine confusion. The kind that comes when a man discovers the future he has been speaking about so confidently was never actually his to distribute. "That cannot be right," he said. Grace slid the signed amendment closer to him. "Your signature appears on page 4. Mrs. Harper's appears on page 5. Your late father-in-law's advisory letter is attached in the file copy. I drafted the final review myself." Nathan leaned forward, his eyes moving over the pages with increasing disbelief. "Dad," he said, almost under his breath, "you signed this." Richard did not answer. Amber finally found her voice. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, but even she sounded unconvinced now. Grace looked at her directly for the first time. "No, Miss Cole. The misunderstanding seems to be yours." That silence afterward was unlike the earlier silences in the room. Before, the quiet had belonged to performance, to manipulation, to people waiting for me to accept a smaller version of my own life. Now the silence belonged to collapse. Mr. Bennett lifted one of the proposed transition packets, compared it against the trust language, and visibly paled. "These summaries omit controlling provisions," he said carefully. "Significant ones." "Yes," Grace replied. "They do." Richard put both hands flat on the table, as if he could steady himself by force of posture alone. "I was told the older agreements were mostly symbolic," he said. "By whom?" Grace asked. "Someone who had actually read them." He said nothing. That was answer enough. I sat very still and watched it all unfold, not with triumph exactly, but with the strange calm of a woman seeing reality return to its proper shape after being bent by other people's arrogance. Amber's elegant certainty was gone now. She looked down at the papers as though they had personally insulted her. Nathan looked sick. And Richard, the man who had placed his hand on another woman's back and called her the future of the family, was beginning to understand that he had walked into this room carrying a story, while Grace had arrived carrying the law. Grace, turned one final document toward Mr. Bennet. There is one more relevant provision, she said. In the event of proven efforts to sideline, displace, or financially diminish Mrs. Harper through concealed planning, acting authority over the trust becomes exclusively hers pending formal review. Mr. Bennet read the clause twice. Exclusively hers, he repeated. Temporarily and potentially beyond that, depending on findings, Grace said. Richard stared at me then, and I saw it at last. Not remorse. Not yet. Something colder. Fear. He had thought he was replacing me with a newer face and a cleaner narrative. Instead, he had documented his own attempt to push me aside, inside a law office, in front of witnesses, while relying on papers that had left out the only details that mattered. He had not destroyed me. He had exposed himself. And when I lifted my eyes to meet his, I did not smile. I did not need to. By then, the room already knew exactly who had built the future and who had just destroyed his claim to it. No one spoke for several seconds after Grace finished. The city skyline beyond the conference room windows remained bright and indifferent, cars moving below, people walking with coffee cups in their hands, the whole world continuing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside that room, everything had changed. Richard was still staring at the documents in front of him, as if a longer look might somehow rearrange the ink into a future that favored him again. Amber had gone very still, the kind of stillness that comes when calculation stops working and pride has not yet figured out what expression to wear instead. Nathan sat with both hands pressed against the edge of the table, breathing through his nose, looking older than he had that morning. Grace, by contrast, looked exactly the same as when she walked in. Calm, precise, finished only when the facts were finished. Mr. Bennet cleared his throat and shifted the incomplete packet Richard had prepared to one side, as though it had become contaminated by its own dishonesty. Given the full documentation, he said carefully, I do not believe this meeting can proceed in the manner originally proposed. Richard looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means, Grace answered before the younger man could soften it, that your attempt to pressure Evelyn into surrendering rights she continues to hold was based on incomplete and materially misleading presentation. It also means that any further action involving the trust, the residence, or the firm will now be reviewed under the very clause you hoped she would never notice. Nathan turned to his father then, and the look on his face was not merely disappointment. It was recognition, the painful kind, the kind a grown child wears when he sees, all at once, that the parent he respected has been performing decency instead of practicing it. You knew, Nathan said quietly. You knew there were protections, and you tried to move around them anyway. Richard opened his mouth, but there are moments when language abandons people who have used it too casually. I was trying to simplify things, he said at last. Nathan let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except it carried none of the ease laughter is supposed to bring. For yourself, he said. Amber gathered her folder with slow, careful movements, but her hands were no longer steady. She looked toward Richard as if waiting for him to restore the illusion, to say something smooth and authoritative that would put the room back under his control. He had nothing left to offer her. That, more than anything, was when I saw the truth of her presence. She had not attached herself to a strong man. She had attached herself to a story about power, and now the story was failing in public. I rose from my chair then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with the quiet certainty of a woman who had no reason to remain seated in a false negotiation any longer. The sound of my chair moving against the hardwood floor seemed louder than it should have been. Everyone looked at me, even Richard, especially Richard. I picked up my purse, straightened the cuff of my sleeve, and looked first at Grace. Thank you, I said. She nodded once, as though gratitude were unnecessary but appreciated. Then I turned to Mr. Bennet. I trust any future communication will be sent through proper counsel. He stood immediately. Of course, Mrs. Harper. Only then did I look at Richard. For 41 years, I had measured my words around him at important moments, choosing calm over embarrassment, restraint over spectacle, loyalty over whatever grievance might have been justified. I did not owe him that carefulness anymore, and yet I still did not raise my voice. At the moment you replaced me, I said, you believed you were stepping into a better future. What you were actually doing was destroying your claim to the one I helped build. His face changed again, but this time I saw something closer to understanding. Too late, of course. Understanding is a poor substitute for character. Amber lowered her eyes. Nathan looked at me with something raw and apologetic, and I knew without being told that whatever relationship existed between father and son had been altered in that room in ways no later conversation would fully repair. I did not try to comfort him. Some truths are kinder in the long run when they are allowed to hurt. Grace closed her folder. Mr. Bennett began collecting the misleading packets for review. Richard remained where he was, one hand still on the table, as if he needed furniture to keep from falling into the reality he had created for himself. I left the conference room without hurrying. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall and saw not a discarded wife, not a woman who had been outmaneuvered, not someone standing at the edge of a smaller life. I saw Evelyn Harper, 67 years old, white pearls at her ears, navy dress, mother, builder, witness, co-trustee, and, at last, a woman who no longer needed anyone else to confirm her place in the story. By the time the elevator doors opened to the lobby, the grief was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the grief of being replaced. It was the grief of seeing clearly. And strange as it may sound, clarity has its own kind of peace. Outside, the afternoon air carried the faint warmth of late spring. I walked to my car beneath a clean blue sky, and for the first time in a very long while, the future did not feel like something that could be taken from me. It felt like something returning.